Hi all, my name is Katie Boothby-Kung, and I'm the host of Talking Purpose, a podcast where we dive deep into what it takes to build an epic, sustainable, and social impact brand. I fell in love with the idea of social entrepreneurship in university when I started my first small batch skincare social enterprise. From there, I was able to build social entrepreneurship tools and programs at Shopify, and now I'm the director of sustainability at a thriving digital agency called Creative Currency. During this journey, I've learned two things. Sustainability in business can be intimidating, and talking about it is tough. On this podcast, I'll interview experts in social entrepreneurship and brand building so that you have the tools and tricks you need to grow your purpose-driven business. Hello, listeners, and welcome to Talking Purpose, the podcast, a podcast that shares all things sustainable brand building. So welcome. If you're new to this podcast, we are so happy to have you. If you've come back, thank you so much. And if you're back again and you haven't hit subscribe or written a review, we encourage you to do that. It helps other people find this podcast with our sustainability resources and helps them to turn their business into a force for good. So by helping us, you are helping others and the world. So why wouldn't you want to do it? In this episode, I had the pleasure of talking to a friend and old colleague, Shavonne Hasfal-McIntosh. We worked together at Shopify, and I had the privilege of watching Shav build Shopify's diversity and belonging practice and department. Shav has since moved on to be the Director of Diversity and Inclusion at Wealthsimple, another dynamo Canadian tech company. She is a force for radical change, and I'm honored to know her and to share this episode with all of you. Shav has an incredible perspective on EDI and breaks down this nuanced topic with simplicity and without judgment. Together, we discuss that EDI takes time and resources, the importance of product inclusion, and how to build EDI strategies that are true and authentic, that don't tokenize communities. It's some pretty amazing stuff. So sit back and enjoy. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. We are so lucky today to be sitting down with Shavonne Hasfal-McIntosh. She is the Director of Diversity and Inclusion at Wealthsimple. And before that, she was at Shopify. That's how we've gotten to know each other. So hi, Shav. Welcome.
Hi, Katie. Thank you so much for having me on the podcast. I'm so excited to be here.
No, likewise. I'm really pumped to have you on the show. I mean, we've worked together for years, and now you get to share all your knowledge with all the listeners. So yes. Tell us all about yourself and how you came to be the Director of Diversity and Inclusion at Wealthsimple.
Thank you. Yes. So my name is Shav. My pronouns are she and her. Katie told you a little bit about my journey. Started diversity, equity, and inclusion work at Shopify, and now I'm at Wealthsimple. But if I think like really far back into my mind about like how I came to this space at all, because I think everybody has their own journey, I really think about like watching my mother and my grandmother and the roles they played in their communities when it came to just like galvanizing community, making sure people felt supported and had the resources that they needed. My grandmother and my grandpa owned a shop in Grenada. That's where my mom's from. And shops, stores, think of them as little convenience stores, were kind of like the hub and the nucleus for the surrounding area. And my grandmother always made sure that, you know, the men weren't spending all their money on the rum, and that they were making sure that they were spending money and saving money for groceries. My grandma always made sure that, again, people in the community had what they wanted. Nobody, you know, really went without. And my mom plays a very similar role in her community, whether that's her professional community or, you know, the community of Black women she supports, or the community that she supports at her church. She's like always really fundamentally focused on making sure that everybody has opportunities and that they have equitable access to the things that they need. So I kind of grew up just kind of seeing that community building, seeing that equitable community building happening all around me. And before I had the language of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and that kind of being what I was doing, I was doing that in like my day to day. Again, like when I went to university, it was a part of school groups. And I was always making sure, again, people had what they needed. Representation was there. People felt like they belonged. And that's kind of been like the thread that has been woven through every single phase of my professional journey, whether at like Red Bull Canada, again, going to Shopify, and then now at Wealthsimple. But I was able to formalize that role at Shopify, moving from the culture team into diversity, equity, and inclusion. That kind of happened really naturally. Megan Herman, who was the first diversity, equity, and inclusion hire at Shopify, was looking to change her roles, and she kind of reached back to me. And we had a conversation about how culture and diversity, equity, and inclusion, although we were working on those two things separately, are really one and the same. When you're building your cultures within your organizations, they should be equitable and inclusive. Right. And I think, the word culture in tech is like very buzzy, very prevalent. And so I kind of made that commitment at that point to move into that role and just make sure that we were bringing those two bodies of work a little bit closer together. And I was able to do that work for about 2.5 years, 3 years at Shopify, and build an amazing team and learn from amazing folks, really making sure that we were embedding diversity, equity, and inclusion into the mission and what we did as a company, which is really important. And then, I was just like ready to take on a new challenge. I was ready to work for a smaller company and organization. And I really believed in Wealthsimple's mission and what they were trying to do in terms of making sure that all Canadians have equitable access to wealth. And so I had the opportunity to join that team in a leadership role as the director. And it's been an amazing, I think, 8 or 9 months just being able to really embed DEI into the fabric of everything we do at Wealthsimple, whether that's organizational health, whether that's looking at how we market our product, whether that's looking at how we do our research, whether that's looking at product inclusion. We're not far down all those paths. But what's really exciting for me at Wealthsimple is that this is not just like a people HR function. This is just like fundamentally important to our business.
That's amazing. Yeah, it sounds like, at Shopify, you were operationalizing DEI within the organization, but now it sounds like you're operationalizing it across Wealthsimple's entire brand, which I think is a huge step and something important for people to kind of recognize the difference there.
100%. And I'll just say one quick thing on that, which is that oftentimes we get kind of stuck in the HR side of things. So the internal pieces of like building diverse teams and then making sure that they have equitable and inclusive experiences. But the end goal of all of that is to be able to build a better and more informed product, because you're not just hiring people, you're empowering them to impact your product roadmap, how you build your product, how you research, and all that good stuff. And so I'm really excited to be able to do that. We'll build the team, and then we're going to empower that team to inform our product from multiple different perspectives.
Yeah, that's amazing. And it's, it's like this full roadmap rather than just stopping at people and culture. I think that's really evolved of Wealthsimple. So what exactly is DEI? I mean, you've said it a bunch of times here. And why do businesses need to start paying attention to this very important acronym?
Yes, for sure. And so I love the leading with EDI, so that's leading with equity. So DEI, EDI, the D stands for diversity, the E stands for equity, the I stands for inclusion. Just to break it down, different organizations also include belonging. Different organizations have all sorts of different ways that they leverage and use that acronym. I think the most important thing for me is to make sure that the equity piece is in there. And why I say that is because when we talk about equity, we're really talking about the systems, the people, practices, policies, programs that impact the people who are at your organization. And equity means that you're doing the work that's necessary to make sure that those processes, policies, and programs are impartial, fair, and provide an equitable outcome for every single person, which means that it needs to do the work of understanding that not everybody has the same access, has the same opportunities to things, to schooling, socioeconomics, and all of that good stuff. And so I think that the difference between equity and inequality is that equity acknowledges that, systemic barriers, where equality is saying everybody gets the same. Equity is we understand that everybody getting the same looks different for different people, and we're going to make sure that we tailor our approach to that. And then diversity, of course, representation, making sure that your workforce has representation, not just in entry-level roles, but, leadership as well, across engineering, customer service, marketing, people in all the places. And inclusion is making sure that people feel that sense of belonging. People feel like they can show up as their authentic self on any given day, because we know that humans are humans and our authentic selves look different. And, inclusion makes sure that like there's space for that. Why it's important, it's the right thing to do. Like pretty much, I think it's the right thing to do for an organization to make sure that they're not just like hiring diverse folks, but they're really setting them up for success and making sure that people can, grow their careers within their organizations, that organizations are taking a hard look at themselves to see like, what are some of the barriers that might be in place that we have unintentionally created. And let's dismantle those and do the work of like, reflecting on where we've gone wrong and auditing our processes and policies and adjusting accordingly and being okay with admitting that, the admission part's really important. But like fundamentally, you will build a better product, which means you'll be more profitable. And I think that people get a little uncomfortable talking about like the business case for diversity. You don't have to start there, but it is just a fact. Like the numbers, the data have proven that if you have more diverse teams, you give them the space to actually do their work and trust them, you're gonna be more profitable in the end. And isn't that capitalism in business? Right? A little, maybe,
Yeah.
a little, maybe I'm being a little cheeky here, but, that's the thing. So I think it's like the right thing to do is like corporate citizens, but also you're going to be more successful. And so why not do that work?
Totally. Yeah. I think that there's definitely that value creation that needs to be thought of. And I think that, listeners here might not be founders or CEOs, and they're having to convince their leadership team that this is a good thing to do. And unfortunately, it's the right thing to do is not the most compelling argument when trying to get these programs off the ground and getting funding and things like that. So it's good to mention the business case as well, even though it doesn't feel awesome all the time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Don't want to lead with it, but it is necessary. And, inclusive leaders can really hold the tension between those two things.
Mm-hmm. So how can brands go about starting to build a DEI strategy? And what are some key things to keep in mind when beginning this journey? I mean, we talked about maybe selling it to executives and what arguments should be put in place for starting a program like this. But, you've built strategies across two very, very large companies. So tell us more about that.
Yeah. I think the first thing to just acknowledge is that like it takes time. I think that a lot of times when organizations start to embark on this journey, they want to move really quickly. You see that a lot in tech, like move fast, break things, like pivot, iterate. This needs to be really intentional. And I think it really starts with like understanding like why you are doing this work and being able to articulate that. If you can't articulate that why as a leadership team, or if you're a people team and function who are like trying to, again, like convince your leadership team that this is something that they need to do, creating and articulating that messaging in a really clear way is super key. And then I will say, again, I'm going to say it probably a whole bunch of times, like sometimes progress takes time and that is okay. Not everything is meant to go fast and quick. If a company is doing this really quickly, I would be suspicious because I'm like, are you actually doing this in an equitable way? Not just performative. Are you doing this in an equitable way? And are you doing this in a way that's going to be sustainable? Because it's really easy to run out of energy, like, a year in. And we're starting to see that happen within companies and organizations who in 2020, bold commitments, you kind of look back 2 years later, where is this work? What is happening? They tried to do too much too quickly. So again, it's going to take time, acknowledging that, making sure that your why is like very clearly articulated. I think the second thing is just like defining what are the resources that you're putting against this. This is not going to happen by like grace, and this is not going to happen by goodwill. Like you need people and you need money to be able to put behind these programs, just like any other business objective you would invest in. You know, with your thinking about like growth marketing, you got to put money behind growth marketing, and this isn't any different. So I think just like understanding that resources are going to be necessary. And if you don't have that subject matter expertise in-house, it's okay to look out of house. There's so many consultants. Get the help that you need to make sure that you're doing this again in an intentional and equitable and meaningful way. And then there's like a couple things, and I'll keep it really high level. I won't go into like my whole spiel, but I think like gathering data. So like understanding employee sentiments about around how you're doing, like what's working, what's not working, thinking about collecting representation data. So like understanding where your gaps actually exist and not just guessing based on what you think and how you think people identify. There's a lot of securities that need to go into doing that. Like, you know, privacy, doing it anonymously, maybe leveraging a tool like Culture Amp that has like some great resources around that could be something you do, but gather your insights and then take those insights to like understand where you are, what's working, what's not working, what does representation look like? And then again, pacing yourself and creating some short, medium, long-term goals. Again, can't boil the ocean. Do 1 to 2 things really well versus trying to do 10 things subpar. Starting with education might be somewhere where you want to start. And again, there's so many consultancies and organizations you can outsource that with. But in order to set this up for success long-term, your entire team is going to have to understand fundamentally what DEI is, make sure they're brushing up on their acumen. And so if you can't start anywhere because you just don't have an internal team, you don't necessarily maybe have a bunch of resources, start an education. The process of learning, unlearning, and relearning is really going to fundamentally be key for not just leaders, but your entire organization. So those are some things that you can do. Again, understanding why you're doing it, knowing it's going to take a little bit of time. You're going to need some resources to put behind it. Collect that information and data. What you don't measure, you can't improve. And then if you're going to start somewhere, start with learning. And again, there's so many resources available to you. And then, you know, you can start looking at, you know, where are all the places that we have work to do and how are we going to sequence that out? But I would just start there. Those are some great, like 5 places to start before you even go a step further.
That is a great list.
It's
and
a good
thank
list.
you
It
for,
takes time.
Yeah, thanks for, of course, pointing out time, because I know a lot of organizations want this done in a month, or they want something flashy for a day, and it takes time. But then again, that call out that, you know, this isn't free.
It's not free. It's not free.
It takes resources and money.
Exactly. And I will say like 2 quick things. A lot of companies leverage like employee resource groups or DEI committees. I would consider paying those folks. Again, those folks are doing some foundational work to set you up for success long term. So if you have some resources to compensate those folks, even a small spot bonus, something to consider. And then the last thing I'll say that's like important is that worry about sharing this narrative internally first. Don't worry about external, like communication and saying something and putting something on your website. I feel like a lot of companies and organizations kind of hyper index for that. Get it right internally, get your house in order, make sure that you're bringing people along internally for the journey and you're not just sharing the final destination with them. And you can worry about the social sharing, the website, the like press release, all of that stuff at another time, but really just start small, start in-house before you start worrying about external.
That's awesome. And it kind of segues nicely into my next question in terms of what are some common pitfalls that you see when companies start to build out these programs, and how can people avoid them? So obviously, you know, talking externally before internally is one of them. And so, yeah, what are some others?
Yeah, again, not putting the correct resources behind it. I think I answered this question in some capacity, so sorry about that. Resources, not optimizing for speed. Again, change takes time. What you're trying to do is literally dismantle systemic oppression and systemic, you know, racism and systemic sexism that exists in the systems. that takes a little bit of time to undo, and just making sure that, again, you're doing some things quickly. There's definitely some quick wins you can get, but this work is long. This work is steady. This work also can't just be done by anybody. So I said it before, if you don't have that, skill set internally, please hire somebody externally to help guide you along your path. And I think another pitfall that a lot of people do, and I think I probably said it off the top, is they just focus on HR people. So they just focus on increasing representation, and they just focus mostly on inclusion. And they forget that there's this whole equity piece that needs to be done. Again, I love when companies lead with equity, diversity, and inclusion, because equity is really the most important part. It's what's going to make sure that you're not harming people through your initiatives and that they aren't performative. So that's really, really key as well. And then I think the last thing I say is a common pitfall of this work within corporate is just it never gets to product inclusion. I talked about it. It never gets to, okay, we have this fantastic team. We've created the systems and policies and programs to really empower people to grow here and to receive equitable outcomes. And now when these folks are going to maybe start to question how we're doing things, doing our work, building our product, marketing our product, that's where a lot of companies get really defensive and cut it off. And so you never really get the full benefit of your early work, because you don't create the space for those opinions and perspectives to impact how you're building your product. And again, a lot of times why people don't do that is because sometimes it takes a level of slowing down before you can speed back up. Because when you're taking a look at fundamentally how you operate and function as a business, you might have to slow a couple of things down. And capitalism will tell us that there's no time for being slow. It will tell us that we have to always be really quick and really fast. And that's where I find a lot of companies fall short. They do the early work, but when it comes to people challenging, again, having divergent opinions, it's not like a fairy tale. You're not just going to hire people and everyone's going to get along and everything's going to go well. There might be some friction and tension that you experience as you diversify your team and get different sorts of thinkers into your organization. But yeah, if you don't create that space, if you don't remove ego, from the equation, a lot of founders, early founders, CEOs, they're pretty defensive about the way that they've been doing things, and they think it's worked. And so they're not really open to doing things differently. And that's where most of it really falls short, because they're just we tried, we built this diverse team, and then they either left or we had to exit people because they weren't working out, quote unquote. And it's just what did you actually do to set these folks up for success? Were you actually open to hearing different opinions and perspectives? And yeah, oftentimes no.
Right. Yeah. And just to build on that, going back to kind of the grubbier ROI argument is that you're hiring these diverse voices and perspectives, but you're not utilizing them to actually reap the benefit of opening those markets from these perspectives. And so, yeah. Why do you think, I guess in terms of, you kind of already answered this, but I guess it's, the tension and the challenges, but are there other reasons why companies aren't going into product inclusion and going that step further? Perhaps it's
I think a part of it is that when you do look at where representation lays in a lot of organizations, there's still a huge gap when it comes to leaders and leadership teams. And so they're diversifying their team, entry level, intern level, customer service, market, where you traditionally find folks from underrepresented communities. Where you're not seeing representation live is in any of those roles that are key decision makers. And so I think that's a very obvious gap for me. If you have leaders who have various perspectives and again are representative of the world or your region, then naturally you start to get some of that product inclusion stuff happening, like as a byproduct, because you've given, again, you're giving those people the opportunity to impact at a leadership level where a lot of these decisions are actually being made. And then I think like the idea of product inclusion seems like this additional thing that you have to do. And like oftentimes DEI is this thing in a silo that gets done. That's an additional thing you have to do versus it actually being integrated into just how you do things. Like DEI is organizational health. And so if you're striving for organizational health and high levels of engagement, then you're doing DEI. If you're wanting to build the best product possible that can, and again, a lot of companies like I've worked for in the past are very mission driven, values driven organizations who want to do greater good in the world. If you actually want to do that in an equitable way, then you should be doing product inclusion. It shouldn't be this thing that is like an plus. You know, I'm building my product, we're building our product roadmap, we're building our marketing plan, and then we have to build an equitable marketing plan and product inclusion plan. No, it should all just be in. So I think a lot of companies see it as a plus DEI instead of it should just be how you function and operate. And it takes a while to get there. I understand. You do have to call it out at the beginning. And then also just like not having people with the right subject matter expertise to do it and not being willing to invest resources. So, like I always looked at like Annie Jean-Baptiste, who's over at Google, who created like the product inclusion team over there, which is amazing. But Google has invested in that body of work, and that body of work is very well integrated into their product teams. It's not just this like product inclusion team on the side. And so I always tell everybody, read Building for Everyone by Annie Jean-Baptiste. She literally gives you the blueprint of like product inclusion in their book. But yeah, I think like those are, it doesn't happen. The leadership teams are pretty homogenous. People see it as in addition to, and so they, deprioritize the work because they don't have the capacity to do it. And then they just don't have like the subject matter expertise internally to help guide them.
Well, goals for everyone. So
goals.
Building out this strategy should definitely be inclusive of product inclusion as a part of the roadmap.
Yeah.
So this comes up a lot. Let's talk about tokenism versus representation. So what's the difference, and do you see businesses lacking representation for fear of tokenizing communities?
100%. I think a lot of this work and a lot of the barriers to work is fear. People and leaders, organizations fearful of doing the wrong things in the wrong way. And I think that's an okay tripwire to build in that moment of pause, reflection, and research and learning so that you can like take the time to do that before you do an action. And this is, again, why equity is so important. You want to make sure that you're not harming people through your diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. But where it becomes a problem is when companies actually don't end up doing anything at all because they're scared of scrutiny, scared of doing the wrong thing. And so I think something that you really have to like sit with as an organization, especially if you're fairly homogenous, is that it is going to feel uncomfortable, but you have to kind of move through that discomfort. And if you're not just focusing on diversity, but actually focusing on equity and inclusion as well, then that tokenizing shouldn't happen because you're not just hiring people, or you're not just like making a lot of times focus on, I hate the word lowering the bar, but like, sometimes organizations are just like, well, we'll just like, change what we need of the role in order to hire a woman into this role or hire a person who's racialized into the role, which is just like, no, there's like amazing talent who will fit the criteria of what you're looking for. You do not need to like adjust in order to bring people into your organizations. And so, to avoid tokenization is to make sure that you are not doing that. To avoid tokenization is making sure that you have equitable and inclusive people policies, practices, and programs, and that you're measuring, the experience of people from underrepresented communities, that you're measuring the performance rates of people from underrepresented communities compared to their peers, that you're measuring your retention and attrition rates of people from underrepresented communities, in comparison to their peers. Those are the ways you can avoid tokenizing people. Making sure you're paying people equitably, a way to make sure that you are not tokenizing people. Making sure, again, that you've done the work to set up your culture for success. But the first hire of a person from a community might feel uncomfortable because you don't want them to think that oh, they were just a person we hired because they were from this community. But no, if you can point back and be you're the best person for the job, you can avoid that. And I think something that a lot of organizations forget is hiring is not just for your recruiting team or your recruiter. As leaders, you should be actively sourcing talent consistently and making sure that that talent is represented, there's representation within that talent, and investing in those relationships, again, long term. You might have this amazing product leader who is a woman and Indigenous who's at Google, but you are going to invest years of your time, and maybe you will get them to come to your organization at some point. Again, this is the long game, but you can avoid tokenization by doing some of those things. But as a leader, you should be sourcing, you should be diversifying your network. If you're not hiring today, that's cool. Build that funnel, because if you're going to be hiring one day, then you have that funnel that includes representation in it as well. And doing things like surveys, engagement surveys, DEI surveys can also help gauge if people are feeling tokenized, right? You can just I always say leaders or people in organizations, I'm just talk to people and ask them how they're doing, and yeah, it could be scary because if psych safety doesn't exist, a person's openness to actually sharing how they're feeling or doing might be not something that comes up. But you don't have to wait to a survey to ask people how they're doing, how they're feeling. Are they feeling like they're having an equitable and inclusive experience? What can you improve? What's going well? What's not? And so I think it's just just chat with people. Don't have to be scared to chat with people, right? But tokenizing comes oftentimes when organizations over-index for focusing on diversity, and they don't do the work to focus on equity and inclusion. And so they're bringing people into harmful systems that harm them and oppress them and cause different levels of trauma. And it happens all the time. We've seen the amount of folks who are women and caregivers and women of color who've left the workforce over COVID because workplaces didn't pivot enough to actually accommodate folks, or they felt again, they didn't have equitable access to promotions and compensation and all that stuff. It happens all the time. Companies are just let's just hire diverse people. And that's that's the easier part. Right. The hard, right? The easier part.
So in the same vein, and I've talked to a number of companies about where they don't even have a hiring strategy in place. Mm-hmm. And they're nervous about reaching out to certain communities and being a bit more intentional about being in front of these communities, because again, they think of that as tokenism. So maybe talk a bit about intentionality when it comes to building out these programs.
Yeah, I think that one of the ways, and we might get into this a little bit, but the importance of building partnerships with organizations who are engaged with folks from different communities. Those organizations already exist. So you might think of something like a Black Professionals in Tech Network. You might think of organizations like Queer Tech. You might think of organizations like Lesbians Who Tech. There are so many organizations who are already engaged with communities that you're likely wanting to engage. And so reaching out to those organizations to partner with them to figure out how you can also start to engage and build trust with those communities as you hope to hire from them is fundamental and key. You don't need to recreate the wheel. If you just literally write, Black professionals in tech, Indigenous professionals in tech, whatever those search functions are, whatever your industry is, you can likely find a partner organization you could reach out to. who already, again, has that trust with the community and can help advise you on how to do this in a way that is meaningful and not tokenizing folks from that community. But you have to build trust first, like build trust with communities, make sure that you're articulating what you care about. Why do you want to hire talent from that community? What are you going to do to make sure that when they join your organization, they're set up for success? There's a level of that has to happen as well if you really want to do this in an intentional way.
I love that. Yeah, I was going to talk. My next question was going to be about partnerships, but I think that this talks a lot about it, and that it should be, again, on this roadmap of building an EDI strategy, that you do need to build partnerships with communities and relationships that are true and authentic.
Yeah.
Okay, so flipping to internal operations,
Yes.
talk to us a bit about ERGs. What are they? How are they valuable to employees? And how can you work with employees to build your EDI strategy without emotionally burdening them? And so I know that we talked a bit about compensation, and not building in a vacuum, and constantly surveying your team. But let's just kind of pull that out a bit and talk about this ERG strategy.
Yeah, so employee resource groups are groups of employees who, come together and they have like a shared element of their life experience or a dimension of diversity. So oftentimes you see like women's employee resource groups, women in tech employee resource groups, Black employee resource groups that could go across any dimension of diversity. And usually the goal of employee resource groups is to provide support and enhance career development of people from their communities, and also creating just a sense of belonging for folks from their communities. And if you're using them strategically, also being able to, again, indicate back up, whether that's to your like people teams or to your C-suite teams, about like what's working, what's not working, how are people feeling, what's the overall sentiment. And they can be, if you have a DI team, like a fundamental part of your strategy. So making sure that you're getting information that is grounded in lived experience before you go and build that hiring strategy, or before you go and build your performance, strategy. You can really leverage these folks to be kind of like, think of them as like a consulting arm within your organization. You can use them for UX research. You can test things with them. You can test marketing, things with them. They're such a valuable asset, and they're so rich in knowledge and, again, lived experience. I think a lot of times employee resource groups start out as like more so like social, like, so having events for people within their community, or hosting events during Black History Month, National Indigenous History Month, Pride, etc. And so it's a lot of it is about like coming together, celebrating as a community, and then like also, if you're leveraging them well, educating the broader business around like why these moments of time are celebrated and why it's important. But to your point, it's very easy for folks in employee resource groups or DI committees to get burnt out because they have a full-time job that they're responsible for. And as much as the leaders within that community or within your ERG community understand fundamentally the value add, you got to pour back into them, right? And so if you can't pour back into them by giving them a spot bonus, which I highly recommend, I will shout that from the mountains, but I understand that not all organizations might be able to do that right off the bat. Think of other ways you can pour into them. I like to think of like our employee resource group community at Wealthsimple as a leadership incubator. How can we give them opportunities and invest in their growth and development? A lot of times, employee resource groups, they should have an exec sponsor. So somebody from your C-suite or somebody from your senior leadership team who's working with them, who's amplifying the work that they're doing, who's learning from them and taking those insights and sharing it with their friends who are also leaders within the organization. And a key value add of having exec sponsors is like it provides opportunities for really organic mentorship and sponsorship to happen for those people who are the leaders within those communities. It, again, gives those leaders exposure to a broader community that they might not belong to and not have access to unless they're playing that role. So like at ERG exec sponsors, one way you can pour into them. If you have leadership training or learning within your organization, put your ERG leaders into that. Again, leadership incubator, pour into them in other ways. I think like a challenge, but something I really challenge organizations to do is we all have performance cycles, where we're just assessing people's performance. So why not make the work that employee resource groups are doing? We talked about there's a business case reason for this. They're setting you up for success long term. They're going to make you more profitable. Why not take what they do into, consideration when you're going through your performance cycle? I always say CEOs send an email to every single ERG leader's boss to be like, hey, they're also doing this stuff that is like, again, you should be able to articulate why it's important. And so when you're going through performance, something to consider is the work that they're doing here. And then I think the last thing is like figuring out how you can give them maybe some capacity. It's not perfect. It's easy to say like 80-20. But like when work gets busy. But maybe being able to carve out a little bit of time for them to focus on this work so it doesn't become overwhelming, or, at the risk to like their own health and other things. Just like, again, surprise and delight, like little gifts or tokens of appreciation, bringing in people to talk to them about the importance of wellness. There's so many ways to pour into them outside of just paying, but I would say do all of them. And again, if you're working with them strategically, like at Wealthsimple, they're definitely like a leadership incubator. We want to pour into them so that they can grow their careers at Wealthsimple by giving them access and exposure to leaders, training, all that good stuff.
That's amazing. Yeah, lots to think about for sure, and lots to consider when building these programs, hiring these folks, and then creating a culture where they can feel like they can really thrive, but then also contribute to the business's growth and long-term success, which is amazing.
Exactly. And I'll say one more thing. I always say one more thing. And this is where like pulling from our earlier conversation, the tokenizing piece. If you are not at the point where supporting ERGs in an equitable way is something you can do, don't. Like, also, it's completely possible for ERGs to like be affinity groups. So to be Slack channels or groups where people just like, feel like they have each other, they can share those lived experiences and they have their support networks. An employee resource group is more than that. It is a part of your DEI or EDI strategy. There is very meaningful ways to engage those folks and humans. And if you're not ready for that, don't do it, because then you are tokenizing and getting free labor from folks who are already, from underrepresented communities for your benefit. If you are not going to give them the opportunity to impact how you're building your people, policies, programs, structures, don't do it. That's the last thing I'll say.
No, that's incredibly good advice. So thank you. If a brand was starting from ground zero, obviously by listening to this podcast, they're able to map out a full DEI strategy. But if they're looking to just start with one step, what would be your recommendation as step one? I know that it's very nuanced, so maybe there's a couple, but
no, I think start with learning. Again, like I just think it's so fundamentally important. If you don't understand why this work is important, if you are not starting to do the work of, creating awareness and challenging the biases that you might hold, if you don't understand fundamentally what healthy, equitable allyship looks like, if you don't understand the implications of microaggressions and what those things can do to harm people from underrepresented communities, like it's going to all fall apart at some point. And so I think like start with education. Again, there's amazing practitioners. There's amazing free resources online that you can like leverage. I think Quake Lab, Feminuity have some amazing free resources that you can just look up. LinkedIn Learning has some good resources. Like there's resources out there, and I would start fundamentally in learning. And then the second thing that I would, do is just like make sure that like your leaders are bought in. because again, it all falls apart if it's not there at the top. And so getting them on board, getting them bought in, again, you're going to maybe have to meet them where they are. There's a lot of patience that goes into this work. Every DI practitioner has their own approach. Mine is just, I am feeling very comfortable meeting people where they are to bring them along for the journey. And I don't come from a place of judgment. I try and come from a place of understanding. So the things I'm teaching people around empathy and understanding, I also hold myself accountable to. But yeah, without your leaders, it's really tough to do this in a way that will create transformational change. You might be able to do some change, but the transformational change will be difficult. And then the third thing that I would say is that most organizations have programs, policies that impact an employee's experience. So maybe just start with like auditing those things and looking at, again, like your parental leave policy, and is that inclusive? Does it go beyond the gender binary? Starting to look at things like your harassment and discrimination policies. Do you have them? Like, you could start with what you have already and like, audit them to kind of see like where could bias come in, or where can this actually be harmful for underrepresented communities. It'll be a bit difficult if you don't have someone who has a acumen and subject matter expertise, but you can start there. You can look at your hiring process and your performance process. Again, lots of free resources out there to be able to like auditing performance from a DEI lens. You'll find some stuff that exists out there. But I think those are the three places. Learning, again, that cycle of learning, unlearning and relearning, so important. Your leadership's gotta be bought in, and start with what you have. Look at what you have.
That's perfect. I think that summarizes it quite nicely for
Yes.
people who are just starting out. That's amazing. Yeah. Final question.
Yeah.
What are some brands that are just really killing it in this space?
So I'm going to try and think of some Canadian brands, because I think there's a lot of Canadian companies who are doing it really well. And then maybe I'll try and think of a couple that are like more global. But when I like quantify killing it, it's like companies and organizations who I felt have been vulnerable enough to admit where they've gone wrong. It's not just about like what they're doing. And so there's a small agency in Toronto, and it's called Frontier. And if you look up Frontier Agency, you'll find them. Okay. And on Frontier's website, they have a section that's called Doing Better at Frontier. I don't know how updated it is, but that document really clearly outlines their commitment, what they've done wrong. They go into what they've done well, and they start to talk about what they're doing now. And I just thought, it's not like a splashy website, or like it doesn't have pictures, it's all text. But I thought that narrative and that openness to admission was really powerful. And I think the way that they've done it will set them up for success long-term. Another company that I think is highly invested in the DEI space, and it really does come from their CEO, his name's Liran, is Benchsci. And you can look up Benchsci diversity, equity, and inclusion. And they do have like a splashier like website and page, but it's really cool because it shows like the work and their commitments to like their workforce, but how they're actually also trying to change the industry, which is just like, we have been trying to diversify our team, and we're noticing that there's certain groups who are missing from those fields. And so what are we going to do long-term to invest in that work so that it makes it better for us, but really for everybody? And so I just love like the partnerships with organizations. I like their long-term strategy of just like solving for the core of the problem, which is how can we get more people into STEM from more communities. So Benchsci, I think, is like doing a fantastic job, and their CEO Liran is dedicated and committed to this work. Like, whoa. I'm going to say Wealthsimple, and I'm just like, I'll admit my bias, but I think Wealthsimple has also done the same. Wealthsimple has like made demand diversity and create inclusion in an equitable way a part of their value system. While Simple has done the work to just, again, be really transparent and honest, both internally, starting internally, but also that external accountability, like just being extraordinarily transparent about like what we still have to do, the work that's still ahead of us. And they've also like invested in hiring a director level person, which is like a solid commitment, and giving that person, which is me, I don't need to speak in third person, like really the ability and autonomy to challenge like everything we're doing. And that takes a level of real vulnerability to be able to do that, to say like, hey, Shav, come in and tell us about ourselves. And then also, again, building this work into a strategy, making sure that it's a part of a larger conversation. It's not just DEI, it's like organizational health, how we build our product. We're not there yet. Like, we're not doing product inclusion yet, but it's a part of our roadmap. And I feel like very confident that we can get there. And so I think Well Simple, even before I joined, was doing a lot of really meaningful work in this space. When I start to think of more like global or international companies, again, I'm saying like companies that kill it, but like all these companies have like a long way to go. Like a lot of companies are just like very much at the beginning of their journeys. And so one thing I will actually say, and this is not an American company, this is actually a Canadian company. And I'm pretty sure, like 99% sure, RBC, which is a bank, have done an amazing job to create resources and education that are informed and built in conjunction with the Indigenous community. And to me, that is really powerful, because they saw a gap in terms of like their offerings and adoption of their offerings. And instead of just making it a marketing PR campaign, they actually reached out to community to understand what was not working and what they can be doing to work better. That there's probably a lot of systemic stuff that I don't know about that I won't comment on, but like this is what it means to create meaningful partnerships and actually build in a way that is with community versus for them. Invest Ottawa is doing fantastic work in terms of not just through how they're building their team, but their programming, and building informed programming that is accessible to all people. Yeah, I can like pretty much like go on and on and on and on, but like those are to me some of like the companies that have made me be like, oh, okay, interesting. I feel like this is like something that's happening for the long term, and I can kind of see the strategy, I can see the humility, I can see the vulnerability, and I can see that commitment. All of them have something they can be doing better, I'm sure and certain, but I think I liked how they started their journey. And then RBC is just like that one example of like when you're starting to get into product inclusion and thinking about building for everybody, how you can actually do it in a way that's meaningful. How about you? I'm curious to know, like, are there any companies that you would say like that you've observed or seen or been exposed to that are doing amazing things? I mean, this really ties into also sustainability, which is also like DEI, like again, DEI is in everything, environmental sustainability and all those good places. Have you come across any companies or even small businesses that you think are doing like a really good job?
Oh, you put me on the spot.
I did. I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
There are, you know what, I recently read, I watched Drive to Survive, and so obviously I'm now an F1 fan. So I was reading Mercedes' sustainability report, and they have really interesting diversity numbers and goals and community efforts and things like that. So, I mean, not a great answer. I think it's more just recency, but I mean, they're very intentional about, you know, building partnerships in the STEM community with underrepresented groups, especially with a big focus on young women from what it looks like. And so, I mean, that's great. I mean, it's a motorsport. It's certainly not a women's world historically. And so, but again, even just, racialized groups as well,
Yes.
making those intentional steps. So yeah, I thought that was super interesting. So again, it's more recency than
It's all good.
really killing it or not.
No, but they have something out there.
It was a good read. It was only 31 pages, thank God.
Oh yeah.
Which,
they're
also
dense.
shout out to people writing sustainability reports. Like,
Shout
please
out.
don't make me read 100 pages.
Shout out. And I'll say, like, what's really interesting about, what you're saying about Mercedes is just like, and I think which is important when I do look at like companies who I think are like really doing this work well, it's just like the internal focus, the focus on their client and their end user, and then the focus on community. And like, there's usually like companies are focused on those three pillars. And if you're focused on those three pillars, then I'm just like, okay, you're setting this up for success more broadly speaking. Then again, diversity and just hiring and building a diverse team. You're thinking about how this impacts your clients, and how you're going to feed into communities. And I think that that's like really fantastic. And I'll just shout out some places for free resources. Salesforce does open up a lot of their resources. And then also Google has a great diverse marketing tool. If you look Google like diverse marketing tool, they have like open sourced a lot of their resources as well. So Salesforce and Google, if you're looking for open source, great places too.
Awesome. I love it. I'm sure the listeners will be very happy for those. So where can people find you if they're looking to either get in touch or learn more about you?
For sure. I mean, LinkedIn, I do pretty good at LinkedIn. So Shavonne Hasfal-McIntosh, even though everybody calls me Shav, I actually think my LinkedIn is Shav Hasfal-McIntosh. I think I actually changed it there. LinkedIn's a great spot. If you're on the socials, I'm, it's not the most like professional handle, but at Pink Robot TO. So Pink Robot TO after it, or people think it's Pink Roboto, but you can holler at me through Instagram or Twitter and those places as well. But LinkedIn is usually like the best first spot to reach out.
Awesome. I love it. Well, thanks, Shav. I appreciate your time. You're a very busy lady, so thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. And I just say, get started, folks. Just do one small thing. I challenge you all, do one small thing to start on your diversity, equity, and inclusion journeys if you haven't started. And if you have started, take time to pause and reflect, to think about what you've done, but the work that's still ahead of you. Thank you.
Love it. Thanks, Shav.
No problem.
Thank you all for listening. If you're interested in learning more about social entrepreneurship and building a sustainable brand, I invite you to head over to sustainabilityco.me for more episodes and valuable resources to help you launch and amplify your purpose-driven brand. Resources range from supply chain help to impact storytelling and marketing tools. If you'd like to chat one-on-one, drop me a line. I always love hearing from listeners and other sustainable businesses. In the words of the past Layla Jana, make it your business to figure out what good needs to be done in the world and then do it. Talk soon.